You've been listening to President Barack Obama, who's in London on a 3-day visit where he's been hosting a town hall event with a very ethnically diverse audience of young people. He started off by saying that Britain and the United States have shared a very special relationship and their values are quite similar, and that America valued that. He'd also mentioned Her Majesty's 90th birthday and obviously visiting Shakespeare's Globe, which today is the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. With some humour, he addressed a crowd. He talked about how freedom and democracy were important issues and that young people now had the capacity to shape the world and that it was unmatched and that progress is possible. Also quoting John F. Kennedy about problems being solved by man, which were created by man. Well, we can cross to Simon McGregor-Wood, who is in London following Obama's speech. Simon, he was asked a number of varied questions from the audience. Just remind us of some of the points he touched on.
Just last week, 400 young boys has died.
It was a very broad-ranging performance, which of course is still going on, but questions from the audience covered a huge breadth of issues, including initially a question about Northern Ireland, something that the United States has been very closely involved in ever since, of course, the Good Friday Agreement of 1997, the slow rebuilding of trust between the divided sectarian communities in Northern Ireland. The President responding to a question about whether he thinks things are going in the right direction, whether the United States will continue its support. The President warning that things are much better, but it's a long, slow process, reassuring that the audience of the United States will always be there to support the Northern Ireland peace process. It moved on to a question about presidential spending priorities, a joke from the questioner about how his successor, assuming we all think that it might be Hillary Clinton, that received lots of applause and laughter from the audience. President Obama saying, you know, as a president, as a prime minister, as a leader of any country, I guess security of that nation is one of the key priorities. But security, he said, is not simply about having lots of soldiers and equipment. It's about diplomacy, ensuring people get a sense of justice and opportunity. He pointed to the example of persuading the Iranians to divert their efforts away from nuclear weapons. He talked about the importance of aid and development in securing security, mentioned Nigeria and the problems they're having with Boko Haram and the need for education and investment to combat what he called demented ideologies. He spoke, I think, trying to reassure the audience. There's a lot of skepticism here in Europe about this forthcoming trade deal, the TTIP. A lot of people here are worried that the deal will somehow dilute things like workers' rights and regulations on health and safety of European workers and products and services. He got a question on that, and I think he did a pretty good job in trying to reassure people that the US was interested in protecting workers' rights. He gave the example of a recent negotiation with Vietnam that wanted to get access to American markets, but he said the United States said no until Vietnam recognized workers' rights and recognized trade unions and things like that. A question on his legacy. Of course, we are coming to the end of President Obama's term. He'll leave office next January. He joked that he's not quite there yet. He hasn't finished. It's perhaps a little premature to talk about legacy. He's got stuff to do. He might need 10 years to understand exactly what he has and hasn't achieved. But clearly, he thinks that the Iran deal is something that is good. Healthcare, guaranteeing a wider availability of healthcare to the American people, is clearly something he's proud of. That got a loud round of applause from his audience. The world's response to the Ebola crisis, and touchingly, I think that he thinks so far he's acted with integrity and has been true to himself. A personal comment there. And then finally, we heard a question about campaigning, what kind of campaigns work, what kind of things have affected his judgment. He spoke about how he changed his views on same-sex marriage in the United States once people had explained to him the stigma attached to people who were not able to be married. And then also his discussion of the Paris Agreement, this big campaigning issue that's consumed so many activists' energies in the last year, trying to persuade the United States in particular, of course, to take the issue of climate change seriously, and saying that the Paris Agreement, which so many countries signed at the UN in New York yesterday, is the beginning of a long process, but again saying it was a remarkable achievement. So a very broad-ranging, free-flowing, very personal, wasn't it, touch to those sorts of conversations. I think he enjoys these kinds of events, and it is ongoing. But interestingly, for those waiting to hear any more nuanced comments about the UK and the European debate, that question has not come up thus far.
Well, Simon, I want to ask you about the Brexit comments. There's been some controversy, obviously, with what he said, and on Saturday, the British papers reacting to those comments.
Yes, you have to remember that here in the UK, newspapers are very partisan. They take positions on the big issues of the day, and it's no different over this vexing question of whether the UK is going to remain in the EU or Brexit, as it's being called. And so you have very, very mixed reactions to it. The big question, I think, is whether or not this intervention, as it's being called, is going to actually change voter intention. In general terms, this last week, capped with the presidential visit, has been a pretty good week for David Cameron and those campaigning for the UK to remain in the European Union. We've had a raft of figures from the Treasury, the UK Treasury Department, and other international financial organisations warning about the economic costs of leaving the UK. That appears to have convinced a number of people. And now we have this barrage from Barack Obama about why he insists that the UK should be better in Europe, a better ally for the United States. And I think that is going to start reflecting in the opinion polls. The opinion polls are already suggesting that the Remain camp was creating a bit of daylight with those who want to leave. And I think we'll see next week, interestingly, to have a look at the polls to see exactly what effect this Obama visit is going to have.
OK, Simon McGregor-Wood in London, thank you.
That's good.